Today's hearing was about something that is going to happen to you. There's going to come a time in your life, if it hasn't come already, when you will have a very important choice to make. This could happen in your workplace, could happen in your family, can happen among friends. It will be about something that is very important to you and very important to everyone involved. It's a simple choice. But many of you will find that choice very difficult because you will have to choose to tell the truth or say nothing. And saying nothing is always going to be the easier choice. Saying nothing won't put you in a more difficult situation. Saying nothing will let you avoid conflict. And when you have to make this choice, you will know for sure that telling the truth will get you attacked. That's a guarantee if you choose the truth. So what will you choose? When you come to that spot in your life where you have the choice of telling a very important truth or saying nothing, what will you choose? For some people, that actually doesn't feel like a choice at all. For those people, it feels like an obligation, a moral obligation.
Since you determined that I may have something of value to these proceedings and issued a subpoena, it is my obligation to appear and to tell you what I know.
I believe that those who have information that the Congress deems relevant have a legal and a moral obligation to provide it.
John Bolton doesn't believe that. John Bolton should have been in that hearing room today, but he does not believe that those who have information that the Congress deems relevant have a legal and a moral obligation to provide it. John Bolton has provided that information for money to a New York book publisher that is paying him $2 million for a book that will include the information that he is refusing to tell Congress. John Bolton is in exactly the same position as Fiona Hill, who used to work for John Bolton in the White House. John Bolton and Fiona Hill are both ex-White House employees, now private citizens, who were asked to testify to the impeachment inquiry. President Trump, who has absolutely no power over them as private citizens now, told them both not to testify. So they had a choice to make. Fiona Hill chose to tell the truth, and John Bolton chose silence. David Holmes is a career Foreign Service officer stationed at our embassy in Ukraine, and his boss, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, told him not to testify, told him that he could defy the committee's subpoena as other State Department employees have done, at Mike Pompeo's urging. But David Holmes did something that no one working in the State Department thinks they will ever have to do. He refused to obey the Secretary of State because David Holmes felt an obligation to respond to the Congress, a constitutional obligation. They all took an oath of office. David Holmes, Fiona Hill, John Bolton took an oath of office. Every member of the committee hearing their testimony today took an oath of office. It's essentially the same oath that the president takes. It is an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. It's not an oath to a person. It's not an oath to a party. It's an oath to the Constitution, an oath to defend the Constitution. I took that same oath when I served on the staff of the United States Senate. And if you took that oath and you understood that oath and you truly believe in that oath to defend the Constitution, you had to be filled with pride today to watch two people living up to that oath under intense pressure at the witness table in today's impeachment inquiry hearing. What you saw at that witness table was true faith and allegiance. That's another line in the oath. True faith and allegiance to the Constitution. Our first guest tonight, Congresswoman Val Demings, took that oath, and she had this to say to David Holmes and Fiona Hill.
Policies change, but U.S. interests don't, at least not for those true public servants who are committed and dedicated to protecting our nation. Thank you both for being two of them.
John Bolton wasn't there today, but he came to life in Fiona Hill's testimony. She said that in his role as National Security Advisor, John Bolton was frustrated that Rudy Giuliani and Trump Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, and White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney were going outside of normal diplomatic channels to try to force Ukraine to conduct an investigation of Joe Biden and his son.
And he then, in the course of that discussion, said that Rudy Giuliani was a hand grenade that was going to blow everyone up. I had to go to the lawyers to John Eisenberg, our senior counsel for the National Security Council, to basically say, you tell Eisenberg, Ambassador Bolton told me, that I am not part of this whatever drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland are cooking up.
What did you understand him to mean by the drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland were cooking up?
I took it to mean investigations for a meeting.
Did you go speak to the lawyers?
I certainly did. I did say to him, Ambassador Sondland, Gordon, I think this is all going to blow up, and here we are.
Here we are. David Holmes testified, among other things, to sitting in a restaurant in Ukraine when Gordon Sondland whipped out his personal unsecured cell phone and called the President of the United States. That is a phone call that the Russians surely have a recording of right now, since they have very strong telephone surveillance capabilities in Ukraine. And they know who to target, like rich, incompetent American ambassadors who use their personal cell phones to call the President of the United States. Here's what David Holmes heard.
And what did you hear President Trump say to, I'm sorry, not President Zelensky, to Ambassador Sondland?
What I hear the
president say to Ambassador Sondland?
Yeah, he clarified whether he was in Ukraine or not, and he said, yes, I'm here in Ukraine. And then Ambassador Sondland said he loves your ass, he'll do anything you want. He said he can do the investigation.
So you heard President Trump ask Ambassador Sondland, is he going to do the investigation?
Yes, sir.
What was Ambassador Sondland's response?
He said, oh, yeah, he's going to do it. He'll do anything you ask.
And was that the end of the Ukraine portion of the conversation?
Yes.
Afterwards, you described a follow-on conversation that you had with Ambassador Sondland, where you asked him, I think, generally, what did President Trump think of Ukraine? Is that right?
Correct.
What did Ambassador Sondland say to you?
He said he doesn't really care about Ukraine.
Did he use slightly more colorful language than that?
He did.
What did he say that he does care about?
He said he cares about big stuff.
Did he explain what he meant by big stuff?
Well, I asked him, well, what kind of big stuff? We have big stuff going on here, like a war with Russia. And he said, no, big stuff like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani is pushing.
Here's what Donald Trump said yesterday about the man who knows him so well that he can call him on his unsecured cell phone from a restaurant in Ukraine.
I don't know him very well. I have not spoken to him much. This is not a man I know well. Seems like a nice guy, though. But I don't know him well.
But Gordon Sondland knows Donald Trump very well. He knows Donald Trump so well, and that he proved it in the way his cell phone conversation with the president ended.
How did the conversation end?
I only heard Ambassador Sondland's side of the conversation, sir. And at the end of the conversation, he was giving the president advice on how to deal with this ASAP Rocky situation. And he said, they should have released him on your word, and you can tell the Kardashians you tried.
You can tell the Kardashians you tried. Gordon Sondland knows that the Kardashians are very big stuff to Donald Trump. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.